All right, here we go. So today we will be introducing ourselves to Monopoly. We already have studied in quite intensive detail how perfect competition works. And of course, now Monopoly is at the other extreme. And so we're going to see how they're different from each other. And then we'll, after those are done, next week sometime or the week after, we'll start looking at the intermediate cases, such as monopolistic competition and oligopoly. So let's take a look. First, let's just start the notes. I do have a couple of nice videos for you to watch that discuss how Monopoly is different than perfect competition. But first, let me just quickly introduce what we're going to be doing in this chapter. Monopoly. Now, of course, everybody knows that name because of the world famous board game, which everybody in the planet has played. What is the point of Monopoly? What is the goal in a game like that? Who wins? How do you know when? I mean, the game seems to go on forever, but what is it exactly are you trying to accomplish when you're playing Monopoly? What is it? What do you have to do to win? Does anyone know? Well, you have to have all the properties and all the money for that matter. In other words, you are the only person who owns any property. When you have all the properties and all the money, then you are declared the winner. Okay, now a lot of people don't quite get to that point. After a while, they just stop the game and whoever has the most money wins. But because the game can go on for a long time. But the point of it is that there's only one winner. Now, if you look at this word very carefully, the prefix mono means one. So this is a market structure where there's a single producer of a good, but it's more important. More importantly, there's a lot of products where a single company may be the only one that produces it. But the key detail here is that with a monopoly, there's a single producer or seller of a good or service for which there are no close substitutes. Okay, that is the big issue right there. We know, for example, that McDonald's has a monopoly on the Big Mac. And that's true, but it doesn't give them a whole lot of market power because there are so many alternatives that people could choose from if McDonald's charges too much money for the Big Mac. So what we're focusing on here is cases where there's a single producer or seller of a good for which there are no close substitutes, so that if you need this product, you have to go to this company. So that's the most important detail, I think. What else is true of a monopoly? Entry into or exit from the industry is extremely difficult and costly, and in fact, it may even be illegal. When would that happen? If you have, let's say you're a company that has a monopoly because you have a patent on that product. Like, for example, let's say Microsoft with Windows. Now, obviously, Microsoft has a monopoly on Windows, but because Apple is out there and some of the others, that means they have some market power, but Microsoft would never be considered to be a monopoly, because if you don't like Windows, you can certainly switch to another operating system, of which one of the more popular ones, of course, is the Apple, but there's others as well. The thing is, though, then I, couldn't start my own software company and say I'm going to make Windows at a cheaper price than Microsoft. That would be illegal because Windows, of course, is patented or trademarked. I'm not positive what the difference is between a patent and a trademark, but I think a trademark is meant for the brand name. A patent means you've actually discovered something, you have an invention of some kind, and you are the only one who's allowed to produce that product. So let's just take a quick look here just to make sure. What is the difference? Because I'm not a lawyer here. What is the difference between a patent and a trademark, or a copyright? Jeez, there's that too. Hold on. All right, here we go. Okay, they are collectively known as intellectual property and generally refer to the rights associated with intangible knowledge or concepts. Here we go. A patent is a grant of a right to the inventor by the government. So therefore, when you invent something new, you are the only one who's allowed to produce it, typically for up to 20 years. After that, they can expire. That's why new drugs, for example, if a company brings out a new drug and they're the only ones who can make it for 20 years, but then after that, other companies can make generic versions of it. Trademark is the right to use a name, word, phrase, symbol, logo, etc. In other words, you cannot suddenly start up one day a company and call it Coca-Cola because that name has already been trademarked. And then a copyright, that applies to music and books and art and that type of thing. I see. So when you write a book, you have a copyright on it. I guess it wouldn't make any sense to patent it because there's, obviously you did not invent the concept of the book. And you can't have a trademark because there's no brand name. So I guess that makes sense. So copyright is the right, sole exclusive right to works of art, like books, like music, like, any other intellectual property. A trademark is the name or symbol or design or logo. And finally, the patent gives you the right, exclusive right to use that invention. Now, there could be more than one, like Windows, for example, the idea of it would probably be patented. And then the name Windows itself would be the trademark. Okay. But if you've written a book, you painted a picture, you can have it copyrighted. That way, nobody else can use it without your permission. And you could, if you wanted to, charge them royalties for it. All right. So this is how that works. All right. We got that straight. So, but anyway, a monopoly may arise because a company has a patent on a product, which means nobody else can produce it. Now, there's probably at any given time several types of medical products that are patented. Like I remember there was all this controversy over this thing called the EpiPen. Let's see. Let's find out. I remember reading about this, the EpiPen monopoly. The EpiPen is this thing that you can use if you're allergic, let's say, to peanuts. A peanut allergy is typically extremely dangerous. You're not just going to get a little sick typically if you have a peanut allergy. If you have peanuts, you might die. So they invented this thing which gives you a shot of something or other that is supposed to help you obviously stay alive until you get to the hospital. So in other words, it's the purpose of it is to make sure that you have a chance to get to the hospital before they can treat it properly. And so it's short for epinephrine. And apparently somewhere along the way, the company that makes these decided to jack up the price to something really preposterous. And they got a lot of bad publicity for it. And then eventually they backed down and lowered the price to something more normal. But they do apparently have an absolute monopoly on this thing because they would have the patents. Wow. But anyway, so that's what this would be, a company that has an absolute right to produce this product. And that being the case, they could, in principle, charge any price they want. Now, we're going to see in the chapter that just because a monopoly has exclusive rights to sell a product, that doesn't mean they're going to charge an enormous price for it, because a monopolist is still competing in the market with other products that might not be good substitutes, but they're still available. So even a monopolist has to figure out what is the optimal price to charge for their products. If they charge too much money, they'll end up losing revenues. If they charge too little, well, then it just means they're needlessly sacrificing revenue. So the decision as to how to charge or determine what to charge for a price by a monopolist is very different than the case of the perfectly competitive firm. Because remember, the perfectly competitive firm has no market power at all. They just have to choose what everybody else charges. This is different. There is no competition, but they still have to make sure that whatever price they charge is related, or is the price that will maximize their profits. And it isn't necessarily a huge price either. Okay, it depends on what the product is. Now, what else do we need to know about a monopoly? Okay, so entering into and getting out of the industry like this EpiPen thing, nobody else can jump in and create those EpiPens because they have the exclusive rights to use it. They own the patent. Okay. Oh, what are we doing here? The post, you may have not have known this, but the U.S. Postal Service has a government mandated monopoly on the delivery of first class mail. Now, hardly anyone uses first class mail anymore anyway. I mean, really, but still, they do have a monopoly. It would be illegal for any private company to enter into this business. Now, of course, you know that FedEx and UPS and all the rest do deliver packages, but they're not allowed to deliver first class mail. Okay, so yes, that's a big business, delivering packages, but not first class mail. That's a monopoly, but it is created artificially by the government. They don't have a patent, for example. It is designed by the government to make sure that they don't run out of money, basically. Okay, so the firm, because it has the ability, they're the only ones who can produce a product, they have complete control over the price that they charge. In other words, they have market power, which is something that the perfectly competitive firms most certainly do not. Now, what can give rise to monopolies? A monopoly can arise for many different reasons, such as number one, they may have the complete control over the supply of an input that is needed to produce a good. Now, this has happened several times throughout history. What if, for example, I somehow managed to buy every orange farm in the country? I'm the only one who has oranges. Therefore, if somebody wants to make orange juice, they have to come to me to buy the oranges. Okay, that would be a case. Well, it's not a great example because then others could actually start growing oranges as well. But here's a case where this was true. Prior to World War II, the Alcoa Aluminum Company owned virtually the entire world supply of bauxite, which is a mineral. You may never have heard of it, but it is needed to produce commercial aluminum. And so because they owned all of the bauxite, nobody else could make aluminum without getting the bauxite from Alcoa, which means Alcoa could have charged them any price that they wanted to. So that kind of helps. That makes it hard for competitors to jump in because you're the only one who has the supply of this mineral that is essential for producing aluminum. That means Alcoa, for all practical purposes, had a monopoly on aluminum. How about this one? De Beers. You may have heard of De Beers. They're a diamond mining company. And while they never owned every single diamond mine in the world, at one point, they owned something like 85% of the world's diamond mines, which meant that although they didn't have a complete monopoly on diamonds, it was awfully close. So that meant that if you went to a jeweler and bought a diamond, it was a very high probability that it came from De Beers. And so if De Beers chose not to sell their diamonds, then there's not a whole lot anybody could do about it. Or if De Beers decided to raise the price substantially, again, there's not a whole lot anybody can do about it. They had more or less a monopoly on diamonds, okay? And now, of course, well, later on, we'll see some case studies about historical monopolies in the United States. It turns out, and we'll discuss this later on in more detail, that at one point in time, there was a single oil company in the United States. That's it. If you wanted oil, you had to go to them. Now, this company, you may have heard of it, was called Standard Oil. And it was broken up by the government in the early 20th century. It was owned by John D. Rockefeller. So for all those years in the late 19th century, early 20th, if you wanted oil, you had to get it from John D. Rockefeller. So they had an absolute monopoly on oil in the United States. And so that gave them obviously an enormous amount of market power. Anyway, the second possibility is that a firm, as we've discussed, may have a patent or a trademark, which gives it the sole right to produce that good. What are some good examples of this? Xerox, they were the ones who invented the photocopying technology that we take for granted today. In fact, as you know, whenever you make a copy, people tend to say, I'm going to go Xerox this. Now, technically, that's not correct unless you're using a Xerox machine. but it's become so embedded in the language that everybody knows that the word Xerox means make a copy of something because they got there first. Yes, so technically you're breaking the law when you use the word Xerox for anything other than a Xerox machine, but the courts have ruled that it's become part of the language, and so anyone can say the word Xerox without getting into trouble. Now, Polaroid, I understand that they are still around. What happened was, now this is going back quite a ways. It used to be that before digital cameras came along, the only way, I mean, if you took a picture with a film camera, the image would be stored on the film, and then when the film, when the roll of film was used up, you would take it someplace and have it developed. And so it was a very long, cumbersome process. You know, we're so used to digital pictures now, like you take out your phone and you take a picture of somebody and you can see it instantly. In those days, it didn't work that way. You had to take out a film camera, take a picture, and wait for it to get developed to see what it looked like. And so Polaroid invented an alternative to this where you would actually take a picture and this little card would pop out of the camera and it would be covered with all these chemicals. And then you would sit there and watch it. And within about a minute, it would have developed itself and you would have an instant picture in your hands. And so it was a very popular thing to have before digital came along. In fact, let me see if I can find a picture of this. If you've never heard of this, it is quite a bit of, it's a bit archaic now. Let's see what we can do here. So, yeah, well, let's see. I was hoping to get a picture where it was actually, this is what it used to look like. Yeah, it's hard to tell there. They're little, they're very shiny, let's say. They're little pictures. They look pretty good. They're little shiny, they're very shiny that if you had your hands on it, you would notice that right away. But the thing is, it develops right in front of your very eyes while you're watching it. So, and that's what made it seem so cool to people. And so it was very, very popular for many years. And, but now, of course, they're really irrelevant. Although, it says here, Polaroid cameras have made a comeback in recent years. I don't know. I'm not sure why. I guess it's because you can print, you're basically printing it out right on the spot and you can hand it to somebody. But apparently they still exist. I'm kind of surprised to see that. But anyway, that was the cool thing about it. So, you know, you didn't have to wait. The picture would develop itself while you were watching it. In fact, you know what? Maybe there's a video out there that lets you, I really would like you to see how this worked. Yeah, I wanna see the fact that somebody's made a video about this 2 years ago means that there apparently these things are still out there. I'm really kind of surprised, to be honest. I don't understand the logic, but there they are. Oh, here's this guy is, well. Anyway, if you're interested in this, you can watch. I guess watch one of these videos later on. But the bottom line, you can see, kind of see right here, it's coming out of the camera and it looks like a big blur right there. But then it's small stages. It develops right in front of you, and then you've got your picture. So, all right. Well, here's one where you can sort of see it in 3 stages. I don't know, unless you're feeling really nostalgic for the 70s or 80s. I don't know. I mean, I'm not seeing the appeal of it, but anyway, but Polaroid, of course, had a patent on that process, and so nobody else could produce a Polaroid camera, that is. And then Microsoft, of course, as I mentioned before, would have had a monopoly on Windows. And you know, when they came along, this was a big deal because when Microsoft came along with Windows, at that point in time, essentially, basically nobody no individuals had their own computers. I mean, this is back to the 70s now. And the only computers in existence are enormous, they're huge. And realistically, only corporations could own a computer because they're so expensive. And maybe universities and government agencies could have computers, but certainly they're well out of the reach of individuals. Even if they were available, they would have been horrifically expensive. So that really started changing in the early 90s when we first started seeing the earliest desktops. And then laptops came along much later. So, but when Microsoft came out along, there would have been no real point to Windows until people started getting their own desktops and laptops, because they would not have been used. Windows was not going to be used by these enormous mainframe computers held by corporations. It was meant for smaller computers. And so it was sort of invented at just the right time, just as people started getting their own computers. And there was a need for this. And Apple was sort of developing it at the same time with their own operating system. So, but Microsoft does have a monopoly on the production of Windows. And so that, because of course they have the patent on it and the trademark as well. So you cannot go out and start up your own company, like I said, by making your own version of Windows. Okay, now there's a third possibility, or a third way that monopolies can come into being. Economies of scale. What is that all about? Okay, well, let me show you a graph of this. Based on what we've done in the past, we have to think, remember now, when we introduced the concept of average total cost, it was understood that this is a short run concept. We have an average total cost curve. We have an average variable cost curve. And finally, we have marginal cost. Now, these are all short run cost curves. What happens in the long run when we're allowed to change all of our resources? Okay, in the long run, when all inputs are variable, we can define a long run average total cost curve, which is often abbreviated LRATC, or some books call it LATC, to indicate that this is the long run. Now, with the long run, though, the shape can be very different. Because the resources are flexible, there's three basic shapes that we want to consider. The long run average total cost curve, or because resources are flexible or variable, there are three basic shapes that the long run average total cost curve, let's just call it LATC, can take. Okay, number one, we can have a situation like this. Where it just keeps rising. As more output is produced, the costs of production rise. So this scenario has a special name in economics. This situation is known as, all right, let's put it this way. When LATC rises as output increases, this is known as decreasing returns to scale or diseconomies of scale. Okay, now when we have diseconomies of scale, in this case, it does not pay for a firm to expand its size because the average total cost of production are increasing. And so when we have a situation like this, this is something that would be common to the entire industry, most likely. There's something about this product that causes the cost to increase. This may happen if the resources being used are very scarce, so that the cost of acquiring them grows quickly as more output is produced. Okay, so actually, you know what? Let me change this slightly. I just realized I'm doing this out of order. I think it would make more sense for these paragraphs to go together. So in other words, when long run average total cost rises as output increases, this is known as decreasing returns to scale or diseconomies. This may happen if the resources being used are very scarce, so that the cost of acquiring them grows more quickly as output is produced. Okay, now in this case, it does not pay for the firm to expand its size. Therefore, in this industry, whatever it is, we would expect to see very small firms competing with each other. They don't want to get too big because then their own costs are starting to grow very quickly. So then you would tend to see very small firms competing in this market. Each one would probably be highly specialized, and they make something that's unique to a certain sub-market. But because getting bigger doesn't make any sense in this case. So that was the first one. Now, the second case is where let's say that the curve is basically flat. It doesn't have to be perfectly flat. There can be some, let's say this is what it looks like. And so here you can see that the costs of production are basically staying the same no matter how much output is being produced. Okay, so when it's flat like that, it's for all practical purposes, you can make all of this product you want at that same average cost. Okay, so here, the average cost of production remain constant no matter how much output is produced. This case is known as constant returns to scale. Okay, so it's flat. The curve is flat. Okay. That being the case, in this case, there is no advantage. There's no cost advantage to being large, or a cost disadvantage to being small. In this industry, we would expect to see large and small firms competing directly with each other. So in other words, this is a case where you can have big companies and small companies side by side because there's no cost advantage to being large. The large companies can't force the small ones out of business by having cost advantages. Okay, so that's the second case that we want to think about. And then in the third case, we have the one that we're really interested in for this chapter, and that's this one.
Recording in progress.
Now, this is the one that we really like to see. Okay, because look what's happening. Wow. Here, the cost of production, or actually, average cost of production are actually falling. Oh my God. This case is known as either increasing returns to scale or economies of scale. In this case, it pays, I'll put this in quotes, it pays to be big. In other words, larger firms have a cost advantage over small firms. Well, what that means then is that you want to get as big as you can. In other words, it pays you to become larger and larger and larger. So in an industry like this, in this industry, we would expect to see only a few enormous firms competing with each other. Examples would be steel manufacturing, auto manufacturing, aircraft manufacturing. Okay, then you can kind of get the idea, because there's a lot of investment needed to produce steel. And so as you keep getting bigger and bigger, those costs are spread out over more and more units of output. So these are the industries that are where you have just a few gigantic companies competing with each other. You can never jump in, for example, and start up your own steel mill. You'd be wiped out right away, because there's no way you could compete on cost with U.S. Steel, let's say. Another example is the large retailers, such as Costco and Walmart. How do they make their money? Well, they make their money because they're so big, they have so much buying power that they can compete on price in a way that their competitors cannot. So you go to Walmart because they have a little bit of everything, and because the price is lower than you might get somewhere else. They may not always have the best quality, but they always have the best selection, in the sense that they have everything you need under one roof, and the prices are low because they buy such enormous quantities of the merchandise. The same thing with Costco, except that with Costco, you have to pay a membership fee. But once you've done that, you can buy anything they have. Now, the main difference between these two is that with Walmart, you can walk in the door and buy one box of aspirins, or, Costco, they make you buy large quantities of everything. So that one might not work unless you need enormous quantities of everything. Like if you have 5 children or something, you might need to go to Costco. But Walmart, you can buy everything individually. It's just that everything is quite cheap. And then also there's, the other thing about Walmart is that sometimes they run out of merchandise. In other words, they only have so much. And if everybody scoops it up, they could run out. A supermarket usually has a very steady, continuous supply of everything. If they run out of, let's say, I don't know, canned corn one day, almost for sure, they'll have plenty more the next day. Walmart, they can run out of things, but still, if you look around, they can really give you some nice bargains. But how do they do this? It's their size. Now, in the extreme case, though, if the cost advantage of being large is significant enough, it may be the case that only one firm, comes to dominate the market, and all the rivals go out of business. That can happen too. If it really pays to be so big, the bigger you get, you can push your competitors out of the market. And before you know it, you're the only one who's left. And then when that happens, you're now said to be a natural monopoly. That's how it's defined. A natural monopoly means that there is an industry where being big pays so well. In other words, the savings are so significant that you can drive your competitors out of business, and you'll now suddenly be the only one left standing. Now, a natural monopoly is the opposite of the others in the sense that this actually is helping consumers because it means that prices are as low as they could possibly be. There is no other market structure where prices can be that low. Anyway, now, when do you see this kind of thing? Up until the 1970s, I guess I shouldn't say recently, AT&T for many, many decades, because of this situation with phone service being not electronic, not digital, when all that we had was wires for phone service, the government decided somewhere along the way that AT&T was large enough that it would make sense for them to take over and monopolize long distance service and not allow competition in this market, so that you had lots of local phone companies that could compete for local service, but the government granted a monopoly to AT&T to provide long-term service. The idea being that it's the kind of industry where costs fall as the size increases, and so they thought it would be a good idea to have one big company taking care of all the long-distance phone service. By the time it got to be the 70s, technology had advanced enough that they realized that this was no longer such a good idea. And so the company was broken up into many smaller companies, some of which are still around today, although with maybe different names. In fact, if you want, we can look up a list here. What phone companies are resulted from the breakup of AT&T? And of course, you know that AT&T itself is still around, but they, it's just like competing directly with all the others. So they created 7 independent companies. As of January 1, 1984, they were NYNEX, Pacific Telesis, Ameritech, Bell Atlantic, Southwestern Bell, Bell South, and US West. But some of these further split up later on and turned into companies like Verizon, for example. Verizon was once upon a time one of these baby bells, as they were called. It was formed on June 30, 2000 with a merger of Bell Atlantic and GT&E Corporation. So in other words, it is a descendant of the so-called baby bells that were created when AT&T was broken up. They didn't call it that here, but in the public basically called these companies the, quote, baby bells, because they were the spin-offs of AT&T, which for many centuries had the nickname Ma Bell. Okay, people called it Ma Bell for some reason. And so these became the baby bells. And the baby bells eventually merged, and they competed with each other, they merged, they created new names. And so Verizon is basically, you could almost think of it as the grandchild of AT&T. And some of the others as well. I think Sprint was once, not Spring Origin. Sprint was incorporated in Kansas. Oh, that was a local company, Brown Telephone. How do you like that? I didn't know that. How about T-Mobile? Spun off from Western Wireless. Yeah. See, there's a lot of mergers in this business after the breakup. Now, by the way, the same thing can be said about oil companies. A lot of the companies that we know and love today were originally part of Standard Oil. For example, ExxonMobil. I believe that originally it was Standard Oil. That was, I believe, their actual name, when Standard Oil was still around, Exxon was called Standard Oil of New York. And I think Mobil was Standard Oil of New Jersey. So a lot of these oil companies that we have today were actually part of Standard Oil. Yeah, so all this good stuff. Interesting. Look at this. Yeah, Standard Oil, their building is still down there in Manhattan and 26 Broadway. You can see they still have in the top of the building, they used to have a flame going at all times based on the oil that they were producing on the top of the roof. And so here it is. Following a landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision, Standard Oil breaks up into 34 unrelated companies. And well, they don't have the names. That's very unfortunate. But I'm sure we could, when we get to that part of the chapter, we can discuss what companies were formed from the breakup. But Exxon and Mobil were definitely two of them. And of course, they eventually merged with each other to create what we now know as Exxon Mobil. Interesting. Okay, well, anyway, and for it, now remember, we're still talking about the sources of monopoly. Government license. We already saw that the government provided the post office with a monopoly. A license here, now this is before Uber came along. It used to be that if you wanted to have a taxi in New York City, you had to get a license from the government, but there's only so many licenses available, so they cost an awful lot of money. But once Uber came along and the others, that sort of reduced the power of this monopoly. It's still technically a monopoly. You still can't just start driving around and calling yourself a taxi. But unless you're associated with Uber, I guess. I'm not really sure how that works. I think that with Uber, they just hire individuals to drive their own cars. Now that I think about it, I'm not sure how that works. But there are people who do Uber driving, and somehow or other, they don't run into trouble with the laws because they are competing with taxis. How do you like that? Anyway, now remember I did mention once before when we were talking about perfect competition, you have to visualize, imagine if you had an industry with 100 perfectly competitive firms and then somebody comes along and buys them all. And now it's just one gigantic company. That when that happens, the market demand curve for that industry becomes the demand curve for the monopolist. So in other words, the monopolist has a demand curve which represents the entire market, and it is therefore downward sloping, just like any other demand curve you've ever seen. So if you had an industry that had previously been perfectly competitive and one company buys them all out, now the industry demand curve is the demand curve that the monopolist faces, and that means that it's downward sloping. Now, what's interesting then is that if you recall from perfect competition, because the demand curve was flat, the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve were the same curve. That's no longer going to be true here, because what's happening is that in order to sell more units of this product, we have to lower the price. And that being the case, that means the marginal revenue of each additional unit that we sell is going to be progressively lower. And so therefore, this is what the marginal revenue curve ends up looking like. We have our demand curve, and then directly below it is our marginal revenue curve. And if you look at this carefully, you can see the marginal revenue curve can actually become negative. All right, you can't get that with the demand curve, but you can get negative marginal revenues with that curve. And the point of all of this is that the demand curve is downward sloping, the marginal revenue curve is as well, but it's steeper than the demand curve. So what's coming up next? And by the way, I think we're ready to watch our videos, but you'll discover that the cost curves that we saw with perfect competition are exactly the same as they were, as they are here. In other words, that part never changes. The costs are what they are. That's completely independent of the market structure that we're operating in. So we're going to see, not just yet, but how we can combine the demand curve, the marginal revenue curve, and the cost curves to determine how the monopolist should charge, what output it should produce, and what price it should charge to maximize its profits. But before we do that, I think it's time to take a look at some fun videos. All right. Now, by the way, in addition to these regular videos that I found that are just straight ahead economics, I found a series of videos which are all about some of the great figures in economic history, like we talked about earlier, John D. Rockefeller. So I'd like to mix those in as we go along, just so you can get a sense of how this works in the real world. Okay, that's always very nice when you can understand this topic that we're talking about and yet see how it applies to the real world. That's always kind of fun. So let's start with our first look at Monopoly. Okay, let me send that off to you. And let's check it out. All right. How was that? I thought they did a good job of explaining it, bringing it all together. Now, we hadn't quite gotten to the point where we brought together the cost curves, but you can see that one of the controversial parts about Monopoly is that they have the ability to charge a higher price and sell fewer units than a perfectly competitive firm would do. So, this is one of the reasons, as we'll see later on, why regulations exist to prevent monopolies from forming in the first place. If they do, the government has the ability to break them up into smaller pieces like Standard Oil. And that's the reason, to increase competition and make sure that the companies don't feel free to charge as much as they want to the consumers. All right, now let's see, what should we watch next? I've got so many more fun videos here. Let's see. Let me check something out here. All right, I'll tell you what, just because we were talking about it, and it's really an interesting uh, real world example of this, I do have a brief video here about Rockefeller and Standard Oil, which why don't we watch that next so that you'll know what a real world monopoly looks like. Okay, so I'm going to send that off to you right now. Then we can get back to more of the economics videos about how monopoly works. So let's check this out, though. I think you'll find it to be extremely interesting. Oh boy. Well, I wasn't expecting those ads, but still, I thought you'd find that interesting because he, obviously monopolized the industry. That's how he became so crazy rich. And there, as they were saying, that even Jeff Bezos, is not nearly as rich as John D. Rockefeller was at the end there. So now, I mentioned before that one of the reasons why monopoly is controversial is because the prices that they charge are higher than they would be in a more competitive market, and the quantity is also lower. So we're going to take a quick look at some of the drawbacks to monopoly. So let me just send this off to you right now. All right. So yeah, that's we haven't talked about consumer and producer surplus in quite a while, although we spend a lot of time with it. The idea here is that compared to perfect competition, of course, monopolies charge higher prices and they reduce output. So therefore, there is a deadweight loss to society, which we could calculate, and we will, when we get more deeply into those curves, which the next time we meet, we'll start looking more closely at not only the demand and marginal revenue curves for the monopolist, as we see here, but we also need to combine all of that with our cost curves so we can start to analyze how the monopolist determines how much output to produce, but also what price to charge. And then we can use that information to determine how much profit the monopolist is actually making, if any. And then what we're going to see is that the price elasticity of demand, we will need it again to analyze the monopolist profit-making situation. And it turns out elasticity plays an important role in determining the optimal price charged by the monopolist. So we'll have a lot of interesting things to look forward to. But in the meantime, I guess it is getting kind of late. Maybe we could just stop it right here. And next time we meet, we'll just carry on with this chapter. Chapter 10, 16 rather, 16, our discussion about monopoly. When this is done, we'll be switching over to the hybrid case, which is monopolistic competition, which realistically most businesses in the United States are organized as monopolistic competition. It's sort of a mix of both, as the name suggests. So we'll be looking at that, not right now, obviously, but when we're done with monopoly, the next chapter after that would be our discussion about monopolistic competition, which opens up the door for a lot more discussion about how this works in the real world. All right, in the meantime, I guess we'll knock it off here, and then I hope you have a good weekend. And if there's no last minute questions, I'll see you all on Tuesday. No, unfortunately, no. That'll probably have to wait till the end of the weekend. I'm still working on them. Sorry about that, but next week for sure. Other than that, anyone else? Okay, I'll see you all on Tuesday. Bye. You're welcome. Have a nice, you too. Have a nice weekend. You too. Thanks.